Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 19. I am the show's host, Kyle, and today I'm going to be spending most of the show focusing on the conflict in Yemen. But first, I'd like to remind everybody, if you like the show, if you're interested in the show and want to help see the show grow, please give me a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. It will help more people to see the show, and share the show with anybody who you think may be interested in a foreign policy-based podcast. All right, with that, we'll start with the Yemen conflict. So around the time we have the other Arab Spring uprisings, Tunisia, Syria, Libya, we also have an Arab Spring occurring in Yemen. This is, I think, 2010, 2011. Before the Arab Spring and before we have any conflict in Yemen, Yemen had been plagued by wars for years and years. The U.S. drone war had been operating there since 2001. The president of the country, Saleh, who was I guess the easiest way to say it would just be puppet of the United States, had fought 4, maybe even 5 wars against a group in the north known as the Houthis, who I'll talk about a lot more later. We have a lot of illiteracy and child poverty in Yemen. It was, prior to this, even the poorest country in the Middle East, and with tons and tons of people being very poor, living in small villages, and in a lot of them, living off of farming or raising livestock. So you have the situation in Yemen. In the history, Yemen was actually not one country all the time. It was the north and the south. The Soviets had a lot of influence there, and even some of the people in the south still have communist ideas. So lots of interesting things going on. So Arab Spring occurs, and Hillary Clinton in the U.S. kind of hijacked the Arab Spring and organized a one-man election in Yemen. So the star of Hillary's one-man election, the only man on the ballot, was the former vice president, and his name was Hadi. Hadi, like Saleh, wasn't a very good guy, and he also started a war with the Houthis in the north, and was generally acting in a way that was negative towards the Houthis. And so what we have resulting from this is the Houthis being battle-hardened from all their wars with Saleh, and Hadi, who didn't have as much power as Saleh did as president, just because in the Middle East, it's not like in America, where we think that no matter who takes power, the military is generally going to fight as hard for Trump as they do Obama. It doesn't matter. However, imagine a situation in America where when Trump took office, a few brigades of the army went with Obama, and even if they didn't wage direct war with Trump and his army or anything like that, it would just severely diminish the power that Trump would have as president. And so when Saleh left office, a large part of the army went with him, and I don't know if they even turned and fought against Hadi right away. But Hadi picked a fight with the Houthis, and then from the north of the country. So if you look at, I guess the easiest way to do this, and I should do this at the start before I get into it too much. So everybody, I would just suggest next time you can, take a quick peek at the map of Yemen. It's really going to help you to understand this conversation. So in the northwest of the country, we have the group that I will refer to as the Houthis, and they are an ethnic branch known as Zaydis. And they're not exactly Shia Islam, but but on the scheme of it, they do lie more in line with the Iranian Assad Hezbollah access over the Sunnis, like Sunni states like Saudi Arabia. But this is more complex, and to be quite honest, I don't understand the religion or the technical or the ethnic differences between the two. But for the purposes of our discussion, the most important thing is going to be that the Houthis are Zaydis, and they're going to have views that oppose Saudi Arabia and align more with Iran. And then in the rest of the country, it's kind of a mix. You got communists, you got al-Qaeda, you got Sunni Muslims, and just a whole host of different groups. But the Zaydis, the Houthis, are from the northwest of the country. If you look at a map of Saudi Arabia and kind of trace your finger straight south from, I think, like the Mecca Medina area, that's where you're going to get the Houthis. The capital city of Saudi Arabia is kind of central west. So if you go to the center of the country and then go straight west, you're going to find the capital, Sana'a. Maybe it's a little in the north. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of the names. And if you keep moving your finger south, you're going to on the coast, on the west coast of Yemen, you'll find the city of Taiz, T-A-I-Z is how it's spelled. And then if you keep moving down, kind of in the Gulf of Aden, you're going to have the city of Aden. And so whenever the Houthis, whenever Hadi picked a fight with the Houthis, and the Houthis went to war with the government of Yemen, they were less powerful than they were under Saleh, the previous dictator. And you have a situation where the Houthis were able to actually fight off the Hadi army pretty easily, and then were able to go sack Sana'a. They were able to take the city and put Hadi into exile. I believe Hadi ended up fleeing to Saudi Arabia. So at this time, the Houthis continue to push south, and they take a lot of territory between Sana'a and Aden, all the way down really to the city of Taiz, T-A-I-Z again. They move east in the country, but I think there's a lot of empty desert out there before you would get to the oil fields, so I don't know how hard or to what extent the Houthis have moved east. Yemen has a population of 26 million. It's a fairly decent-sized country. And so I think pretty much everybody's lives around the coastline and towards the oil fields, but I think those are more in the east of the country. So after the Houthis start to win the war, you have Saleh joining forces with the Houthis. And so now a large part of the Yemeni army, before Hadi took over, and the Houthis, a very powerful fighting force, are now leading a large part of Yemen. They have set up some form of government and are claiming at least a legitimate government as being the legitimate government in the north of the country. In a reaction to this, we have Saudi Arabia starting a air war against the people of Yemen and forming a coalition with a few other Gulf Arab states. I know the UAE has troops deployed there, and Kuwait, I believe, has also supported, in Qatar. And this actually started March 26th, 2015. So the reason I'm doing and putting out this show today is that it is the 2-year anniversary of the Saudi involvement in the war. Now, if we all go back and look at our timelines, we're going to realize that the Iran nuclear deal is a big news story at this time, and the U.S. ends up backing Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen solely because they wanted to prove to Saudi Arabia that we weren't betraying them to be closer to Iran because we had the nuclear deal. This actually ran Washington Post, New York Times. Anyway, Samantha Power outright says, we were supporting the war in Yemen to placate Saudi Arabia over the nuclear deal with Iran. And so this, to me, is one of the most disappointing parts of the story, and we'll get more involved with the U.S. support later, but the U.S. is solely supporting this war because we felt bad for making the nuclear deal with Iran with our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's a real mess, and if you think about all the reasons in the world to support a war, I would have to imagine one of them on the bottom of the list has to be to help hurt feelings. So that coalition starts heavily bombing all the Houthi-held areas. In response, the Houthis have actually fired a couple missiles into Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, you're not going to get good reporting on these stories, and if you ask the Houthis, you could have rockets that reach almost Mecca, Medina, or Riyadh. Or if you ask Saudi Arabia, the missiles barely made it across the border and they crashed in an empty desert. I have seen reports that the Houthis have carried out some raids and missions into Yemen. However, once again, I mean, the reporting coming out of there, it may be that the Houthis, snuck across the border one night and shot some Saudi troops. It could also be that they did make at one time some significant progress or gains into Saudi Arabia. And now Pakistan actually is putting troops in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, they say that they are not there to carry out any raids involvement in Yemen, but they're just to protect Saudi Arabia from the Houthis because Saudi Arabia actually has a really weak army. I think they have quite the air force, and I have no idea about Navy, but I guess they don't have much of armed forces. This may be because an air force requires less men to operate, so maybe Saudi Arabia is afraid of giving guns to so many of their civilians. Who knows? And for the Saudis' part, they currently have a blockade and are conducting air raids in Yemen. The UAE has troops stationed in Yemen. From what I could tell, Saudi Arabia is trying to raise an army, a Yemeni army in Aden. ISIS, al-Qaeda has actually attacked these army units a few times, killing lots of people, like 50 or 60 people. And the al-Qaeda attacks usually occur when the troops are going to pick up their pay. So they're really trying to scare, I guess, Saudi Arabia away from raising an army in Aden. And so I guess this kind of summarizes the players. This is more or less where we are today. Fighting continues. Sometimes you see reports of the Saudi side making progress. Sometimes you see reports of the Houthi side making progress. It seems to me that if kind of the status didn't change and people who have forces there continued at their current involvement, then it seems likely that this is a stalemate and that the Houthis can at least control a chunk of the north and cannot get down to Aden, and the same the other way around. This is, of course, with the last Saudi and outside help on the part of the Hadi government. Like I said, just things being equal the way they are now continues, then I think it's a pretty bloody and awful stalemate. I would like to talk now about the Houthis' connection to Iran, because every U.S. mainstream media news story gets this wrong. So if you pick up and read any story about Yemen, one of the things that's just going to be mentioned matter-of-factly is that Saudi Arabia is engaged in a war in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthis. This is a real mischaracterization of what's going on there. The Houthis have asked Iran for weapons help, and Iran flat out told them, no, we're not going to give it to you. The Iranians gave the Houthis advice a few times during this conflict. They told them just to fight off the Hadi army and don't go attack Sana'a. They said, don't go south of Sana'a, and both of the times the Houthis didn't listen and did what they wanted. Typically, the way this is portrayed is that Iran is funneling weapons to the Yemeni Houthi fighters. However, they're not doing it, at least not en masse. The two main shipments of weapons that the Saudis claim were Iranian ships going to Yemen were actually not headed to Yemen. One was, I think, moving away from Yemen, and the other one was on its return trip from Sudan or Somalia, maybe. Either way, I guess my point is that these weren't Iranian shipments of weapons to the Houthis. There are reports that weapons are getting across from the border of Oman into Yemen and making their way to the Houthis, but these are small arms shipments at best. I don't think it would be unlikely if there were people in Iran who have sympathy for the Houthis and really don't like Saudi Arabia, that maybe they're buying, a crate full of AK-47s and sending them to Yemen. However, it doesn't seem like there's direct support from the Iranian government to the Houthis. And part of the reason this will make more sense is that it's always portrayed as there's a huge Sunni Shia fight in the Middle East. And while this is true that they certainly disagree with each other, Iran hates Israel more than they hate Saudi Arabia. And so Iran's real goal is to help Hezbollah fight against Israel over the Houthi Yemeni fighting Saudi Arabia. For them, it's more advantageous to funnel weapons and use all of their support to engage in weapons deals and anything to help Hezbollah against Israel. To them, the fight against Saudi Arabia is less important, so they're not supporting the Houthis. If Iran is supporting the Houthis as well, it certainly hurts their ability to support Hezbollah. I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of the same weapons, money-wise, and also just on the international scale, you could probably use some international capital. I know in the U.S. to be called political capital, but whatever it is on the international stage to at least gain some defense of Hezbollah from Israel. Whereas if you're trying to do that with the Houthi too, then it makes it easier for them to portray you negatively in the international media. And so that's the Iranian involvement in this current conflict. It's not as extreme as every news source will make it seem and just say that the Houthis are Iranian backed. It's simply not true. And for a comparison, the U.S. has given arms to al-Qaeda people and groups they knew that where they gave them weapons, they knew those weapons were going to al-Qaeda in Syria. And so if you wanted to claim that the U.S. is backing al-Qaeda in Syria, then Next, I'd like to talk about the U.S. involvement in Yemen. I think there's a lot of Americans who would have no idea that the U.S. is fighting a war in Yemen, but we really are providing a lot of support to the war in Yemen, to the point where you could say we're fighting the war in Yemen. The U.S. is providing mid-air refueling to all the Saudi bombers going into Yemen. They are... It had the Saudi fighter jets have to take off from the air base in Saudi Arabia and fly to the capital of Sana'a. They will only be able to stay in the air about 10 to 15 minutes over the capital city. And I really don't think they could reach all that much area anywhere south of Sana'a. And so it would really create a problem for the Saudi military trying to bomb them. However, the U.S. has provided mid-air refueling to all the Saudi jets. And so this allows the Saudi jet to refuel in midair over Yemen and fly in the air for, hours at a time. This allows for more bombing, more targeted bombing further south, and it really makes the war there possible. I know at the start of the war, the U.S. was providing logistical support as well. I don't think Saudi Arabia was really advanced in their ability to, carry out bombing campaigns in other countries. And so the U.S. was helping to provide intelligence. The U.S. is also supporting the blockade of Saudi Arabia, or of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. I don't know if there's obviously U.S. ships in the area. There was reports that the Houthis fired at one of those ships. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I think the missile landed 10 miles away, and the media portrayed it as a near miss. So the U.S. ships are at least out there while the Saudi Arabia is enforcing the blockade. We have the U.S. providing Saudi Arabia with diplomatic cover at the UN. Because the Saudis' war and bombing campaign in Yemen, they were actually put on a list of countries that target children, with some blackmail towards the UN as saying we're not going to give you money anymore, combined with U.S. diplomatic support. They were able to get their names taken off of that list. I guess the last thing I'd like to do in this part is just talk about the al-Qaeda-ISIS relationship and how this is different than it is in Syria. In Yemen, al-Qaeda and ISIS have fairly just much merged. They're really interchangeable names. There's no caliphate in Yemen, so I guess there's not that argument that they have in Syria. Also, the U.S. has been just killed so many terrorists in Yemen and create so many more with all the terrorists we kill. A lot of the older guys have been killed off, and rather than fighting each other, I guess they just kind of blended in with the younger crowd and call themselves ISIS. I think a lot of it has to do probably with fundraising dollars. Like, if you're a terrorist group trying to get money from a rich person, ISIS probably has a little bit better brand name right now, or at least did up, in the past couple of years. And so the Saudi war in Yemen has really prevented the al-Qaeda guys from fighting their main enemies, the Houthis, and weakening the Houthis to the point where al-Qaeda could really fight back against them. Al-Qaeda controls a bunch of territory in Yemen and is doing pretty well there. I think they even controlled like a port town near an oil field at one point, and that town's close to Aden. So, I mean, the situation there was getting pretty serious. I think the UAE army has reined in al-Qaeda a little bit. Like I said in the beginning, al-Qaeda has carried out some pretty serious attacks against the Saudi war effort in Aden. I think in a lot of places too, and this comes from the article in The Intercept I read dealing with the U.S. raid in Yemen, we have a situation where in central Yemen, you have bad actors all over the place. You have the Houthis, you have al-Qaeda, you have the Saudi-funded government and the UAE-funded government. And so people probably have a tough time picking what side they want to be on. And also you have the U.S. carrying out a drone war in Yemen and U.S. carrying out anti-terrorism raids in Yemen. These really conflict with the U.S. goal of working with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, because Saudi Arabia is so heavily fighting the Houthis and being a problem for the Houthis. It's really prevented the Yemeni army from fighting al-Qaeda and has allowed al-Qaeda to grow. And since the Hadi doesn't have much of an army to speak of, you're in a position where you're fighting against the people who would be fighting against ISIS. And so I think a U.S. general even said at one point, we're flying it out as al-Qaeda's air force in Yemen. Next, I'll talk about the humanitarian status of Yemen. Yemen was by no means a metropolis or a paradise going into this civil war, but it's become a disaster ever since. Saudi Arabia is blockading Yemen. They're not letting much in other than food and medical imports, and a lot of times even those shipments are really held up, so food expires or medicine expires or goes bad waiting on shore, or people are starving and dying waiting for that food or medicine. I know they're now directing a lot of those medical and food supports to go to dots in the south of the country. This is partly because they've hit the infrastructure on the dots in northern Yemen, and so they're not able to offload the big cargo. However, I'm sure there's also reasons that if the food and medical aid go through the south of the country, then the Saudi government has a little bit more control over it than if it's just given to the Houthis. You have a large problem with starvation in Yemen. I believe like 60% of the country is now in emergency or crisis food starvation, shortage mode. There's over 400,000 children in Yemen who are malnourished. I think it's close to 250,000 that are severely malnourished, and you need hospital treatment to cure that. You can't just start eating. And this war is just absolutely brutal on the civilians. Deaths from war, the UN puts the number, I think, at like 12,000 now. However, there's a very good journalist from Yemen, Nasser Arabi. I suggest you check him out on Twitter and follow him, who says that total is near 60,000. The UN admits that they only count deaths that occur at hospitals in that number because that's the only way they could get it. So it doesn't count the people who die in their homes or die on the way to the hospital or anything like that. And because Saudi Arabia has bombed so many hospitals, especially in northern Yemen, and fighting in the south between the Houthis and the Hadi army, it has destroyed hospitals as well. A lot of people in Yemen are just dying in the middle of nowhere and hospitals. And so, like I said, this journalist, Nasser Arabi, puts that number at, I think, 50 to 60,000 people have died. Maybe post-war we will be able to get like a census of just how many people are in Yemen and maybe be able to extrapolate from some stats exactly how brutal and bloody this war ended up being on them. Adding to the starvation problem in Yemen, Yemen was a country that heavily imported its food prior to the war, and with the blockade, there's now a whole lot of food produced there. I know you have a lot of people that are, like I said, like goat farmers or livestock farmers. But in wartime, livestock's kind of a desperate commodity because if somebody shoots your livestock supply or destroys the plant that processes the meat or whatever, it's really going to disadvantage you. So when you have situations like the botched raid in Yemen and you have the United States killing off a whole, what is called a flock of goats, a whole 100 goats or so, that was the livelihood of families in that village. And so that's dangerous. You also have Saudi Arabia bombing like factories and plants, and I don't know if they bombed a particular plant where they would store, process, or package meat or anything like that. But the overall damage to civilian infrastructure like factories certainly harms that general process. Part of the reason that Yemen is such a heavy importer of its food is because of International Monetary Fund loans and grants and stuff like that. I will try to link to an interview that was done on the Scott Horton show, kind of detailing how Yemen got to this place, but it's kind of complicated and technical, so I don't want to get into it here. You have a lot of hospitals just simply running out of medical supplies. Hospitals are leaving areas because either they have no supplies to help anyone or they're being bombed so much by Saudi Arabia. I know at least 2 Doctors Without Borders hospitals in northern Yemen have been bombed by Saudi Arabia. I believe one of those airstrikes was actually intentional. They were trying to bomb an ambulance or something and hit the hospital. You also have, just like I've been detailing, but large bombings of civilian infrastructure by Saudi Arabia. You have a hospital, a wedding, and a funeral both being bombed with over 100 casualties in each. The video of the funeral bombing was a rough one, and it was actually in the fall of 2016. Obama did reduce some weapons into Saudi Arabia because of that. You had the hospital the wedding that was bombed pretty early on. In Yemen, you just have situations where kids can't go to school, and if they do go to school, parents are looking at what schools have the best infrastructure for withstanding a bomb, because Saudi Arabia bombs schools with children inside. They bomb hospitals, they bomb factories, they bomb ports. They're really destroying all the infrastructure. I believe they even bombed a water treatment plant. And so one of the last parts I would like to talk about are U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has always sold a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia. However, I like to focus under the Obama administration moving forward. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and her Clinton Foundation had received between $10 and $25 million from Saudi Arabia And as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton approved nearly $100 billion in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. In total, the Obama administration approved $150 billion in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Lots of these weapons sales are planes and bombs that go to bombing civilians. I believe I read an article actually that said by this point, Saudi Arabia would pretty much be out of bombs. And if the U.S. wasn't supplying them with more, they would no longer be able to bomb Yemen and simply have a lack of bombs. I think that goes to show two things: how necessary that the U.S. support is for Saudi Arabia, also support of UK, because the UK provides them with a lot of weapon sales as well. But how important and critical that support is, and just the vast number of bombs that Saudi Arabia has dropped on the civilians of Yemen. So I'd like to finish up by talking about what we could expect from Yemen moving forward, what the future of this country might look like, and what the future U.S. role in the country is. First, Yemen is nearing, if not already is in famine. The food crisis is only going to get worse unless the international community puts a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade. I don't think we're going to see any progress on this front, and the people of Yemen are likely to continue to suffer, starve, and die, including a lot of children. Like I said in the beginning, I think without additional support from one side or the other, this war will be fought to a stalemate. I do think that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are probably going to increase support to the Hadi government until the Houthis have to essentially just give up, because they're all going to starve and die and be bombed to death. I mean, we could nearly be looking at a genocide type situation occurring in Yemen pretty soon. And then the U.S. role moving forward. Under Trump, it has been pretty clear that he supports more involvement in Yemen. This has been one of the few things he said. Even after the botched raid, he kind of doubled down on his position in this country. So not only is he going to continue to fund and support Saudi Arabia to fight against the enemies of al-Qaeda, he's also going to fight al-Qaeda himself with U.S. troops and U.S. bombs. At some point, you would think the American people would start to ask themselves, is it worth it to put more Americans on the ground in Yemen to possibly die like one man did in the raid in the beginning of Trump's administration? But it doesn't seem like we're going to get that question asked by the American people just yet. Weapon sales to Saudi Arabia from the UK and the US will likely continue. Both countries have had some brave legislators try to step up and say no to this. I think it had a little bit better chance of passing in UK, and in the US it doesn't have much of a chance. I know senators like Chris Murphy, Rand Paul, and representatives. I know just Thomas Massey has expressed some concern about this as well, saying like, "Hey, what are you doing here? Why are we giving so many weapons to Saudi Arabia? Could we start by cutting down on the weapons going to Saudi Arabia?" Unfortunately, they haven't had much success with this, but the fact that they're trying is meaningful. And if you ever see these senators pushing anything, anti-Saudi Arabia, remember back to this podcast and what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemen, and think about maybe, giving your senator a call and just saying, hey, you really got to support this because what Saudi Arabia is doing isn't good. Also, those senators may or may not be on the payroll of Saudi Arabia and probably get lobbied pretty hard by Saudi Arabia, so don't tell them, don't let them be crooked. And I think that sums it up for what I wanted to say about the conflict in Yemen. Like I said in the podcast, this is 2 years in one day now. It's just absolutely devastating war on the civilian population there. If there's anything that, the war really couldn't be waged without American support. The fact that the bombers would hardly be able to spend time there, that they wouldn't have any weapons left because they would run out. All this assistance we're applying with the blockade and the international cover for this, it would really not be allowed to happen if it wasn't for the U.S. support. So all it takes is a call from President Trump, and let's hope we get it one of these days. All right, if you guys like this podcast, please leave me a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and share the show. If you like what I do, check out my blog, kylesfilesblog.com. Files is Files. Join the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. We talk about foreign policy stuff in there. And follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE.